How to knit a reversible beanie. So the first thing you need is your yarn, of course, and a knitting machine. I used a lightweight yarn, and then I brought out 150 needles in a 1 by 1 arrangement, as you see here. So 1 out, 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, and I'm going to speed this up so that we don't take forever with this video. So 150 is like 75 by 75. Then put your yarn into your carriage and knit 1 row. You may want to clip your yarn. I used my machine's yarn clip. You can use any clip you have at hand. Put my comb on and don't forget your claw weights. Then all those needles that were back at A, bring them forward. Set my tension to 5 and my row counter to 0. And now I need 240 rows for my hat, but that's because of the type of yarn I'm using. If you're using a different weight of yarn, you may need to knit a different number of rows, but basically you want to knit a rectangle that's twice as long as the hat you want. Take the yarn out of the knitting machine, and here's where there's a bit of a difference between the process I did for this hat and the first one I showed in my series. So here, instead of taking the fabric off the knitting machine and gathering it, I gathered the top of the hat on the knitting machine. So I'm taking the tail and pulling it through every stitch. So push the needle forward, put the tail over it and pull it through the stitch, and then pull the tail out completely. So in this way, you can gather the top of your fabric while it's still on the knitting machine. Now, this method is quite slow. It takes a while to do. So in a few moments, I'm going to show you another way to gather the top that's slightly faster. Also, if you've got a yarn needle, you can simply thread your tail through the needle and then pull that through all the stitches that you have. Okay, so that's another way to do that. That's faster. Now, before I go much further, I need to take off the comb and the weights so that doesn't weigh down my fabric as I take it off the knitting machine. The second way that I mentioned is to use your latch tool. So you're going to thread that through the stitches. You can only do about 6 or 7 at a go. So put the latch tool through the stitches on your needles. And then once you've got that on your latch tool, take the stitches off the needles on the main bed. And now you can take your tail, put in your latch tool and pull it through those stitches. So this method is faster than the first one because you can gather 6 to 7 stitches at a time. But like I said, the fastest method is to use a yarn needle and thread your tail through your yarn needle and then pass your yarn needle through all the stitches that you have on the knitting machine. I did not have a yarn needle at hand, otherwise that's what I would have done. So most likely in a future video, I will show how to gather your yarn gather your edges rather using a yarn needle. So we're just going to go down our work until we've gathered. So if you're gathering properly, when you pull it, it should come together, and when you relax it, it should become wider. Yeah. So for the last 4 stitches, I'm going to gather those, and then my work will be off my knitting machine. Voila, now we're done. So here's what my fabric looks like right now. This is the reverse side, and this is the public side of my fabric. When I pull on the tail, the top of my fabric pulls together, and at this point you can start to imagine the hat coming together, so that would be like the top of the hat. And because of the way I cast on, if I go to the bottom edge and I pull on the tail that I have at the beginning, my bottom edge will also gather. So this is why you should cast on the way I showed it in this video, because it makes gathering the bottom edge quite easy. But if you didn't, you could still use yarn needle and an extra length of yarn and pull it through your bottom edge to gather that edge also. Okay, before we gather both edges, we're going to do something first. We're going to fold our fabric in half like this. We're going to make sure we have the right side and fold it in half with the 2 side edges face together and join the side edges. Okay, so we want to join these edges on the knitting machine. If you have a sewing machine, it makes your work faster. If you have a linker, go ahead too with that. So remember, right sides together. I've put my corners on. I leave a bit of a sag so that when I join, my seam is smooth and it's not stretched out and wavy. And then I'm going to pick up the edge onto my needles, speed this up so that it doesn't take forever to do this step, but hopefully you get the idea. And if you have any questions about this process, to leave me a comment and I will respond. Last bit of pickup, and once that's done, take note I have all my needles out to E. Put the yarn back in the carriage, adjust the tension to a higher value, and knit 1 row to join the 2 edges together. Take my yarn out and bind off my stitches. Here's my tube. So now we can gather the top, pull on the tail. The extra tail that I got from binding off, I tuck that into my tube. It's going to be hidden in my hat. Then gather the top edge by pulling on that tail that I used to gather my hat. Okay, so when I finish gathering, I still have a slight hole in the center, and I'm going to close that using my latch tool and my tail of yarn. So this section of the video goes slightly out of frame. My apologies for that. But basically what I'm doing here is just using my lash tool and making sure that there is no hole in the center, sewing that center closed. And at the end of that, fasten off my yarn and then go from under the hat inside and pull that tail in to the inside of my hat. And then onto the other edge, the top edge or bottom edge, however you want to think about it. I'm going to pull the tail to gather it to a point. And just as with the opposite edge, once it's gathered to a point, I'm going to sew the slight hole that I have closed. Now, we're going to tuck that edge into the other edge. That's how you form the reversible hat. So, tuck one gathered edge into meet the other edge, and voila, you've got a hat. Okay, and then there's one last step. So, I want to sew those two gathered edges, gathered points together, and I'm going to use that last tail that I have and sew the 2 points together. So you can use a yarn needle for this, it's much easier. I didn't have a yarn needle at hand, so I used my latch tool and sewed those 2 points together so that it doesn't move. This step isn't compulsory. Some people have the 2 points separate, but I like them together because it forms it into a hat. When it's separate, you can use it as kind of like a scarf, a neck warmer almost. But when it's sewn together, it's definitely a hat, a beanie. So once I sew them together, fasten off my yarn, then the last step is that I'm going to thread my tail of yarn into the hat, because at this point my hat is going to have 2 layers of fabric, and so I'm going to thread it into the space between the 2 layers. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's really easy to hide details when you're doing this sort of hat. So both inside and outside look the same. Imagine if you knit half of your fabric in one color and the other half in a different color. You would have like 2 hats in one. Okay, so I'm going to thread my tail into the center, into the middle of the hat. And then cut my tail, and that's it. You've got a reversible beanie. Isn't she a beauty? So here's how it looks put on. I made mine a bit roomy so that when I make my hair in big braids, it will still fit. So I've got extra room in it.